The river was screaming. Annie Dugan heard it from inside the house, that terrible roaring that the Cimarron made when the spring rains pushed it past every boundary God and nature had set for it. She heard it, and she told herself it was only the wind, only the storm bending the cottonwoods, only anything other than what it was. Because what it was meant something impossible was happening on the other side of those black, furious waters, and she could not let herself believe that. Then the knock came. 3 hard strikes against her front door at midnight, and Annie was already on her feet before the echo died, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that frightened her. She grabbed the oil lamp from the kitchen table and crossed the front room in 4 steps, and when she pulled the door open, the storm blew a sheet of cold rain directly into her face, and she nearly dropped the lamp entirely. Jacob Mercer stood on her porch. He was soaked through to the bone. His dark brown coat was plastered to his shoulders, and his hat brim was pouring water in a steady curtain, and there was mud on his boots all the way to the knee. He was breathing hard, that particular kind of breathless that meant a man had been pushing himself past what was safe, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing something she had never once seen them do in the 3 years she had known him. They were desperate. Jacob Mercer, who was never desperate. Jacob Mercer, who was the proudest, most controlled, most infuriatingly composed man in all of Cutter's Bend, Oklahoma Territory, and possibly in the entire western half of the United States. Jacob Mercer, who had watched a man draw on him in the middle of Main Street 2 summers past and had not so much as blinked. That Jacob Mercer was standing on her porch at midnight after crossing a flooded river, and he looked like a man who had finally run out of excuses to keep his mouth shut. "Jacob," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I know what time it is," he said immediately, like he needed to acknowledge the absurdity before she could use it against him. "I know the hour, and I know the river, and I know you have every right to shut that door in my face." She did not shut the door. "Then why are you here?" she asked, even though some part of her, the part that had been quietly breaking for the better part of a year, already knew. He pulled his hat off and held it in both hands and looked at her with those dark eyes that had never once told her anything she needed to know until this exact moment. "I should have said this sooner," he said. "I know I should have. I know I waited too long, and I know what that waiting cost us, and I know you have every reason not to want to hear it now. But Annie, I crossed that river tonight because if I did not say it and something happened, if that storm got worse, or if Harlan Briggs does what I think he's planning to do tomorrow, I could not die with this unsaid." The lamp flame guttered in the wind between them. Annie Dugan stood in her doorway at midnight in the Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1887, looking at the most stubborn, most guarded, most quietly devastating man she had ever known, and she felt the last 3 years rearrange themselves behind her eyes into something that made a different and far more painful kind of sense. She stepped back from the door. "You better come inside," she said, "before you drown on my porch." And that was how it ended, or rather, how it began to end, and how it began in the first place, which required going back to the beginning, to the day Annie Dugan arrived in Cutter's Bend with 2 trunks, a broken engagement, and a determination never to depend on a man's word again. Cutter's Bend was not the kind of town that appeared on maps produced in the East. It sat in the northeastern curve of the Oklahoma Territory, where a bend in the Cimarron River had convinced a handful of settlers in 1879 that the land was good, and the water was reliable, and a town might take root. By 1884, it had a general store, a smithy, a saloon called the Red Mare, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a telegraph office, and a sheriff who had held the position for 2 years and was already considered indispensable. Annie had not come to Cutter's Bend looking for a husband. That point was important to her, and she made it clear to anyone who asked, including the 3 women who met her at the stage depot on a warm Tuesday afternoon in September of 1884, when she stepped down from the coach with her trunks and her carpetbag and her expression of polite, non-negotiable self-sufficiency. She had come because her father's cousin, a Mrs. Clara Hobbs, had written to say that the town had need of a schoolteacher, and the position paid $12 a month with a small house provided, and Annie had been in St. Louis at the time with nothing holding her there except a humiliation she was doing her best to leave behind. The humiliation was named Robert Vance, and it was not necessary to spend much time on him. He had been charming and well-dressed, and he had asked Annie to marry him in April of 1884, and she had said yes. And by July, she had discovered that he was already engaged to a woman in Cincinnati who had the advantage of a significant inheritance, which Annie did not. He had not even apologized with much conviction. That was the part she could not forgive. Not the betrayal itself, which was devastating enough, but the casualness of it, as though her trust had been a thing of such small value that its destruction did not merit real remorse. So she had come west, which was what people did when they needed to become someone new. Clara Hobbs was a round, warm woman in her 50s who smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, and whose husband ran the general store. She had shown Annie to the small house on Cedar Street, which was 2 rooms and a good stove and a window that faced east, and Annie had set her trunks down and looked around and felt something cautiously like possibility. "There are good people here," Clara had told her, "and some not so good, same as anywhere. You'll learn which is which fast enough." Annie had learned, and the process of learning had included meeting Jacob Mercer on her 3rd day in Cutter's Bend. She had been walking to the schoolhouse to take inventory of the books, which were few and mostly outdated, when a man came out of the sheriff's office directly across the street and nearly walked into her. He stopped short, and so did she, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that was slightly too long at the collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something difficult, and he wore a badge on his vest the way some men wore a scar, like it was simply part of him, and had been for long enough that he'd stopped thinking about it. He looked to be in his early 30s, perhaps 32 or 33. "Beg your pardon," he said, and stepped to the side. "No harm done," she said, and stepped to the same side, and they did that awkward shuffle for a moment before they both stopped and chose opposite directions with some deliberateness. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said. It was not quite a question. "Annie Dugan," she confirmed, and did not offer her hand because she was carrying a notebook and a pencil and was not disposed to make the gesture easy for him. "Jacob Mercer," he said. "Sheriff." "I assumed from the badge," she said, and then continued walking. She heard something behind her that might have been a short, surprised sound, possibly the beginning of a laugh, but she did not turn around to verify it. That was how it started. With accidental collision and deliberate distance, which, as it turned out, was how they would conduct themselves for the better part of the next 3 years. The problem was not that they disliked each other. That would have been simpler. The problem was the opposite, and they both knew it, and neither of them was in a position to do anything uncomplicated about it, for reasons that emerged gradually over the months that followed. Annie's reasons were Robert Vance, and everything he had made of her trust. She had come to the Oklahoma Territory to build something independent, something that belonged to her and could not be taken away by a man's hidden motive or a woman with a better inheritance. She was 24 years old, and she was teaching 18 children in a 2-room schoolhouse, and she was managing her own house and her own money, and she was not looking to put any of that at risk on the word of another man, no matter how steady his eyes or how carefully he stepped around her whenever she was clearly carrying things. Jacob's reasons were more complicated and took longer to understand. She pieced them together slowly, the way you piece together a map from fragments, over the months that they developed what could only be called a friendship if you define the word loosely enough to include significant amounts of unspoken tension, and the kind of careful distance that 2 people maintain when they are both very aware that less distance would be dangerous. He brought her firewood in October without being asked, leaving it stacked outside her door before sunrise. She found out it was him because Clara Hobbs saw him and told her, and Annie did not say anything to Jacob about it, but she did leave a jar of the apple preserves she had made from the tree in her yard on the step of the sheriff's office with a card that said only "Thank you" and no name, because they both knew whose handwriting it was. He came to the school Christmas program in December and sat in the back row and applauded with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that seemed to surprise even him. She saw his expression when the children sang, and it was unguarded in a way that his face almost never was in public, and she filed that image away somewhere careful. In February, someone broke into the general store and took a month's worth of wages from the safe, and she passed the sheriff's office at the wrong moment and saw him sitting at his desk with his head in his hands, and she stopped without meaning to and knocked on the doorframe, and when he looked up she said, "I heard about the robbery. I'm sorry. That was Hector Hobbs's money." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "I should have seen it coming. The lock on that back window has been weak for months." "You can't watch every window in town every minute," she said. "That's exactly what I'm supposed to do," he said, not bitterly, just factually, and she understood then that this was not a man who made excuses for his failures. He carried them instead, quietly and completely, which was admirable and probably very lonely. "Did you find who did it?" she asked. "Not yet," he said, "but I will." He did find out 2 weeks later. It was a drifter named Cody Fawkes who had moved on to Guthrie, and Jacob tracked him there and came back with both the man in custody and the money intact. And Annie heard about it from Clara and felt something warm and sharp in her chest that she did not examine too closely. The spring of 1885 brought a land dispute between two of the larger ranches north of town, the Ketterly Spread and the Deacon Operation, over grazing rights on a strip of creek land that both families had been quietly burning toward conflict about for years. Jacob spent 3 months walking the line between them, talking and listening and negotiating with a patience that impressed people who watched him work, and eventually brokered a boundary agreement that both sides accepted, mostly because neither of them wanted to give Jacob Mercer a reason to stop being patient. Annie watched all of this from the particular vantage point of someone who taught the Ketterly children and the Deacon children in the same room, and therefore had a professional interest in the resolution. She and Jacob had occasion to discuss the situation several times, in passing on the street, once at Clara Hobbs's Sunday dinner table where they were both guests, and she noticed that he was careful never to reveal more than he needed to about his strategy or his opinions, but that when he did express a view he was precise and honest and did not soften things to make them easier to hear. She respected that about him. She also found it frustrating in the particular way that honesty is frustrating when you are not ready for it yourself. By the summer of 1885, the town of Cutter's Bend had settled into a general consensus about Annie Dugan and Jacob Mercer. The consensus was that they were clearly suited to each other, and it was only a matter of time, and everyone from Clara Hobbs to the barber on 4th Street to Deputy Tom Castles, who was a young man of 22 with large ears and an earnest disposition, had an opinion about why it was taking so long. What the town did not know, because neither Annie nor Jacob had told anyone, was why the distance existed at all. Jacob Mercer had been engaged once, 9 years before he came to Cutter's Bend. He had been 23, and she had been a woman named Margaret Farris from the county seat of whatever Kansas town he had been working in at the time, and she had been clever and steady, and he had loved her with the straightforward certainty of a man who believed that things worked out if you were honest and worked hard. She had died of typhoid in the summer of 1879, 6 weeks before the wedding, and he had gone west afterward not to forget her, but because staying in Kansas felt like standing in the room where something had been and finding it empty every single morning. He had not told Annie this. He had not told most people this. Tom Castles knew because Tom was observant, and because Jacob had told him once, carefully and only once, when Tom asked why the sheriff never seemed interested in any of the eligible women in town. The other thing Jacob had not told anyone, including Tom, was the thing that made the situation with Annie Dugan different from any situation that had arisen in the 9 years since Margaret. Which was that somewhere in the second month of knowing Annie, he had looked at her across the table at one of Clara Hobbs's dinners and realized with the quiet devastation of a man watching a bridge wash out, that he had stopped thinking of her as simply someone he respected, and had started thinking of her as someone he could not imagine not knowing. And the gap between those two things was enormous and frightening, and he had responded to it by doing what he did with most things that frightened him, which was to become very controlled and very deliberate, and to tell himself there would be time. That particular lie, that there would be time, is one of the great betrayals a person can commit against themselves, and Jacob Mercer would come to understand that completely on the night he crossed the Cimarron in flood. But that night was still 2 years away in the summer of 1885, and the story had other things to do first. In August of 1885, a man named Harlan Briggs arrived in Cutter's Bend. Harlan Briggs was 38 years old, broad, loud, and possessed of the particular kind of confidence that comes from having always had enough money to make other people's objections irrelevant. He had come from Texas with a crew of 6 men and a plan to establish a cattle operation on the range land south of town, and he had the capital to do it, which meant the town of Cutter's Bend had to take him seriously whether it wanted to or not. He was not a villain in the obvious, twirling mustache sense of things. He was something more complicated and therefore more dangerous. He was a man who believed genuinely that what was good for Harlan Briggs was ultimately good for everyone in proximity to Harlan Briggs, and who had enough charm to make other people believe it temporarily before the evidence clarified things. He donated a new set of McGuffey readers to the school in his first week in town, which made Annie slightly suspicious of him, and which made most of the town decide he was a fine addition to Cutter's Bend. He began calling on Annie in September of that year. He was attentive and generous, and he asked her opinions about things and listened to the answers with apparent interest, and Annie was not immune to being treated well, particularly by someone who did not seem to have a hidden motive. She was cautious. She was always cautious now. But she was also 25, and she had been lonely in the particular quiet way that capable, independent people get lonely, because their capability makes them look like they do not need anything, and their independence makes it easier for other people to believe that they are fine. She had dinner with him twice at the hotel dining room, chaperoned informally by the simple fact of a public space, and she thought about what she felt afterward the way she thought about most things, carefully and analytically. What she felt was something like interest and something like wariness, and something like the absence of whatever it was she felt when Jacob Mercer walked into a room, which was a comparison she did not make consciously, but which her body made without her permission. Jacob watched Harlan Briggs pursue Annie with the expression of a man watching something inevitable and terrible from a distance too great to intervene. Or rather, with the expression of a man who told himself the distance was too great, when in fact it was a distance he was maintaining by choice, which was different. Tom Castles watched his employer during this period with increasing concern and occasional exasperation. "You could simply tell her," Tom said one evening in October when they were both sitting in the sheriff's office, and the night was quiet enough that unspoken things became louder. "Tell her what?" Jacob said, without looking up from the report he was writing. "The thing you've been not telling her for a year," Tom said. Jacob set down his pen. He looked at Tom with the patient, slightly tired expression of a man who was not going to pretend he did not understand the conversation but who also was not going to have it. "It's not the time," he said. "When is the time?" Tom asked. "When I've got something more certain to offer than my word," Jacob said, and there was something in his voice that closed the subject, something old and not entirely healed, and Tom, who was observant, understood that this was not simply about pride and left it alone. It was around this same time that Annie began to notice the cracks in Harlan Briggs. The first crack appeared in November, when a family of Cherokee settlers who had established a small farm on a piece of land adjacent to the range Briggs was claiming were asked to vacate the property. The request came through a lawyer from Tulsa, and it was technically legal, or at least it had been constructed to appear legal. But the basis of it was questionable enough that Jacob spent 2 weeks examining the land records and concluded that the Cherokee family, whose name was Falling Deer, had a legitimate claim that predated Briggs's purchase. Briggs accepted this conclusion with surface equanimity and withdrew the legal action, and that should have been the end of it. But Annie noticed the way he spoke about it afterward, privately, when he thought no one of consequence was listening. She was at the Red Mare with Clara Hobbs for the town social, which was a monthly event that occupied the saloon on the first Saturday and involved music and food and general community, and no whiskey, until after 9 in the evening by the agreement of everyone involved. And Briggs was talking to one of his men near the door, and she caught a fragment of his voice saying that Mercer had overstepped, and that some arrangements did not need to involve the sheriff's office. She filed that fragment away and did not dismiss it. The second crack appeared in January of 1886, when one of Briggs's hired hands, a man named Dix, got into a dispute with a shopkeeper over a debt that Dix claimed he did not owe, and the shopkeeper's window ended up broken in a way that Dix claimed was accidental. Jacob arrested Dix and held him overnight and fined him for the damage, which was standard procedure, and Briggs came to the office the next morning to discuss the matter in a tone that was polite and absolutely immovable in its implication that Jacob had made a mistake. Jacob's response was to be polite in return, and equally immovable in his insistence that the fine stood. Annie heard about this from Tom Castles, who told it with something close to admiration, and something shifted in her chest a little further in a direction she had been trying not to name. Spring came and summer came, and the fall of 1886 arrived, and the situation in Cutter's Bend began to tighten in ways that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with the way power works in small places when one person accumulates too much of it. Briggs had been buying land steadily throughout the year. He had a right to do so, and the land was available, and individually none of the purchases were alarming. But by October, they began to form a pattern that Jacob recognized with the grim, quiet attention he gave to things that were not yet crimes but were moving in that direction. The purchases surrounded the water sources. Not all of them, but enough of them. The Cimarron bent around the north of town, and nobody could buy that, but the creek that fed several of the smaller farms east of Cutter's Bend ran through land that Briggs now owned on 3 sides. Jacob went to talk to Briggs about it in November of 1886, and that conversation was not entirely pleasant for either of them, and it was not successful in changing anything, but it established clearly that Jacob Mercer was watching, and that Harlan Briggs was aware of being watched, and those two facts began to sit in the town like two stones that the water runs between, wearing everything gradually into a new shape. Annie had ended the dinner visits with Briggs by September. She had not made a drama of it. She had simply declined 2 invitations with reasonable excuses, and then told him plainly, in the way she told most things, that she did not think they were well suited, and she hoped they could maintain the cordial relationship that was appropriate between a businessman and the town's schoolteacher. Briggs had accepted this with better grace than she had expected, which made her wonder if he had not been as invested as his attentiveness implied, or whether his actual interest had been in something adjacent to her rather than in her directly. Jacob had not said anything about it when the visits stopped. He had not said anything about the visits when they were happening either, which was the problem, which was the thing Tom Castles kept pointing at, and which Jacob kept not quite looking at directly. What Jacob did say, in January of 1887, was something small and significant. Annie had come to the sheriff's office to report that one of her students, a boy of 9 named Eli Ketterly, had not been at school for 3 days and his family had not sent word, and she was concerned. Jacob listened and asked 3 specific questions and then said, "I'll ride out to the Ketterly place this afternoon." "Thank you," she said, and turned to leave, and he said her name. "Annie." She turned back. He was looking at her with that careful expression, the one that gave almost nothing away, almost. "Are you well?" he asked. "Generally. I know the last few months have been complicated with Briggs and everything." She looked at him steadily. "I'm well," she said. "Thank you for asking." "I should have asked sooner," he said, and there was something in his voice that lived below the words, something she heard but could not hold onto because he was already looking back at his desk. She walked home and stood in her kitchen for 5 minutes thinking about those 4 words, and then made herself a cup of tea and thought about something else. Eli Ketterly was fine, as it turned out. There had been a family illness and the father had simply neglected to send word, and Jacob had ridden out there and confirmed it and come back and written her a brief note that was delivered by Tom Castles and said, "Eli is well, family illness, recovering. He'll return next week." And then at the bottom, in slightly different ink as though it had been added after, "I was glad you came to tell me." She kept the note. She told herself she did not know why. February of 1887 brought the situation with Harlan Briggs to a different kind of head entirely. The evidence Jacob had been assembling for 6 months, careful and methodical and legally solid, reached a point where it was actionable. Briggs had been diverting water from the Eastern Creek in a manner that constituted criminal interference with the water rights of 4 families, and he had done it through an arrangement with a county land clerk in Tulsa that had its own illegal dimensions. Jacob had correspondence, signed papers, and the testimony of 2 of Briggs's own hired men who had grown uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. He had sent all of this to the territorial marshal's office in Guthrie in late January, and was waiting for the marshal's response, and he was not telling anyone in town what was coming because he did not want Briggs to know it was coming. That was the sensible course. It was also a lonely one, carrying that particular weight in silence. He told Annie in February, not all of it, but enough. He told her because she had asked him directly how the water situation was progressing, and he had reached a point where lying to her, even through omission, felt like a worse option than trusting her with something important. So he told her that he was expecting the marshal's involvement and that she should not be alarmed if things moved quickly in the coming weeks. She had listened carefully and then said, "Is it dangerous for you?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It could be," he said. "Briggs has men. And he's the kind of man who doesn't accept losing gracefully." "Then be careful," she said, and it came out with more feeling than she had intended, and she saw it register in his eyes, just for a second before he nodded and said he would. March came in like the old saying, forceful and cold, and the situation compressed toward its crisis. The marshal sent word that he was sending 2 deputies to assist with the arrest of Briggs and the Tulsa land clerk, expected in the first week of April. Jacob kept this information tight, knowing that any leak could give Briggs time to disappear into Texas, with enough money to stay disappeared. The trouble was that Briggs was not a fool. He had his own sources of information, which Jacob had suspected, and the subsequent events confirmed. On the 28th of March, 3 of Briggs's men rode into town at midday and proceeded to conduct themselves in a manner designed to test what the sheriff's office would do. They disrupted a business at the general store, spoke to Clara Hobbs in a way that was threatening without being technically criminal, and then positioned themselves outside the school. Annie saw them from the classroom window. She did not let the children see her concern, which was considerable. She kept teaching with the deliberate steadiness she had always relied on, and at the end of the school day she escorted the children out with a calm she was manufacturing from scratch, and watched the 3 men watch the children leave without incident. Then she went to the sheriff's office. Jacob was already on the street by the time she got there, because Tom had come and told him what was happening, and he was standing outside the office with that particular quality of stillness that she had come to recognize as his most dangerous state, the stillness that was not calm but was a perfectly controlled anger. "The children are gone," she said. "They didn't interfere." "I know," he said. This was a message. "What kind of message?" He looked at her. "The kind that says he knows something is coming," he said, "and that he knows where to apply pressure." She understood then what he was not quite saying, that she was the pressure point, that Briggs had seen what Jacob Mercer was careful not to show in public but what was apparently visible to anyone paying close attention. "I see," she said. "I'm going to have Tom keep an eye on the school and on Cedar Street," he said. "Until this is resolved. I know that's not ideal. I can take care of myself," she said, with the reflex of someone who had been saying that for 3 years. "I know you can," he said, without argument, without condescension. "I'd feel better knowing Tom was nearby. That's my reason, not a judgment of yours." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She turned to leave and then turned back because something was pressing against the inside of her chest that she was tired of ignoring. "Jacob," she said, "what happened with your boots this morning? When I passed the office, you were limping." He looked surprised that she had noticed, which surprised her in turn. "Horse threw me Tuesday," he said. "It's nothing." "You should have it looked at," she said. "I know," he said. "You won't," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in that way that was not quite a smile, but was the closest thing to one she got from him in public, and she walked home before that nearly smile could do whatever damage it was capable of doing to her composure. The last 3 days of March were electric with the kind of tension that a small town generates when everyone knows something is building, but nobody knows exactly what shape it will take when it arrives. People hurried through their errands. Conversations ended earlier than usual. The red mare was quieter than its custom. On the 30th, Annie heard a rumor from Annie Dugan, who was 17 and whose family's ranch was one of the operations affected by the water dispute, that Harlan Briggs had been seen leaving his property with 3 wagons loaded heavily. This felt like flight to Annie, but she was not sure, and she went to tell Jacob. She found Tom Castles at the office, who told her Jacob was north of town following up a lead, and that he was expected back by evening. She told Tom about the wagons, and Tom wrote it down with the diligence that characterized everything he did, and said he would make sure Jacob knew the moment he returned. Jacob returned at 7 in the evening, and the news about the wagons had already changed the situation. He rode out to Briggs's property with Tom and found that the main house had been left in a hurry, papers scattered, some furniture left, the wagons gone. He sent Tom back to town with a wire to the marshal's office explaining the development, and he himself stayed at the property until 9, conducting a thorough search that produced, among other things, a ledger that contained sufficient documentary evidence to make the case against Briggs and the Tulsa clerk complete even in the man's absence. So Briggs had fled. Jacob had the evidence. The marshal's deputies would arrive in a week, and the legal matter would be processed, and Briggs would eventually be found or not found. But the immediate danger to the water rights of 4 families was resolved. The immediate danger, Jacob believed, was over. He was wrong about that, as he discovered the following morning when one of the Ketterly Ranch hands rode into town at a hard gallop to report that someone had sabotaged the main dam on the eastern creek during the night. Not destroyed it entirely, but damaged it enough that the water flow to the 4 farms was compromised, and that fixing it would require 2 days of labor that the families did not entirely have the resources for alone. Jacob organized the repair effort with the efficient calm that made people trust him, calling on 6 men from town who had the skills and the willingness. And by the afternoon of the 31st of March, the work was underway, and the dam would be solid again by end of week. Annie had organized her own contribution, bringing food and blankets to the families on the eastern farms whose days were disrupted, and in the process of this errand she and Jacob passed each other on the road east of town in the late afternoon, her going and him returning, He pulled his horse up alongside her wagon. "You didn't need to do this," he said, looking at the food she was carrying. "I know I didn't need to," she said. "The Ketterleys and the others don't need to be alone in this." He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was deeper than usual approval. "No," he said, "they don't." They were quiet for a moment on the road, with the late afternoon light going gold and red over the prairie and the cottonwoods already budded with the first tentative green of the spring. "Is it over?" she asked. "The immediate trouble is over," he said. "Briggs is gone and what he did is documented. The marshal will handle the rest." "Good," she said. "Annie," he said, and stopped. She waited. He was looking at the horizon, and she watched the side of his face and saw something working in it, something that was not quite prepared to come out yet, and then he exhaled very slowly and said, "I'll let you get on. The Ketterleys will be glad to see you." She drove on and did not look back, because looking back would have told him something she was not prepared to give him the advantage of knowing. And she was tired, and it was the end of March, and the creek was fixed, and Harlan Briggs was gone, and she still did not know if Jacob Mercer felt anything for her beyond the careful, measured regard he showed everyone who lived in this town. And then it rained. It rained the way the Oklahoma Territory rains when it decides to take the spring seriously, which is to say it rained for 4 days without meaningful pause, beginning on the 1st of April, and continuing with relentless dedication through the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. By the 2nd day, the streets of Cutter's Bend were mud above the ankle. By the 3rd, the creek east of town was running bank to bank, and the Ketterleys had moved their animals to higher ground. By the 4th, the Cimarron was making that sound. Annie had lived in Cutter's Bend for nearly 3 years now, and she had seen the river rise in spring before, but she had never heard it make this particular sound, which was the sound of something that did not remember it had banks and was not interested in being reminded. It was the sound of genuine flood, and it was the sound the river was making on the 4th of April, the night that Jacob Mercer stood on her porch. But she was getting ahead of herself again. Before the midnight knock, there were the events of the 4th of April from the beginning. Annie had spent the day in her house because the rain had canceled school for the 2nd day running, and there was nothing sensible to do in that downpour except stay dry and be useful indoors. She had graded 3 weeks' worth of arithmetic exercises and mended a tear in her 2nd dress and baked bread, because the physical action of it was good for the particular kind of restlessness she had been carrying since the end of March. She had heard news in the morning from Clara Hobbs, who had come over with a borrowed oilcloth and her characteristic determination to circulate information, that the territorial marshal's deputies had arrived from Guthrie the previous evening and were staying at the hotel, and that Jacob had been in meetings with them all morning despite the rain. She had also heard, with the slightly uncomfortable uncertainty of a rumor rather than a confirmed fact, that Briggs had been located in the Texas Panhandle, and that there were some questions about whether the men he had taken with him were still present, or whether 2 of them might have stayed behind in the Oklahoma Territory for reasons unknown. That last part was what Clara had called the part that Jacob didn't confirm but also didn't deny, which in Clara's experience of following events in Cutter's Bend meant it was probably true. Annie had thought about this while she kneaded the bread dough, turning it over and pressing down and folding and pressing again, and she had thought about 2 unnamed men staying behind for reasons unknown, and she had thought about what Briggs had been willing to do before he left, the sabotage, the intimidation, the positioning of his men outside the school, and she had thought about pressure points, and she had not arrived at a comfortable conclusion. By the time evening came, the rain had not lessened, and if anything the sound of the Cimarron to the north of town had gotten louder. She ate her dinner and tried to read and found that the words on the page did not hold her attention, and by 10 o'clock she had admitted to herself that she was afraid, not for herself exactly, but for something, for the general shape of things, for the unnamed men and the enormous river, and the fact that she was sitting in her house on Cedar Street, and somewhere out there Jacob Mercer was managing things by himself the way he always managed things. She was thinking about this, sitting near the lamp with an unread book in her hands when the knock came at midnight. She remembered everything she wrote at the beginning of this account, the rain in her face, the man on her porch, the desperate thing in his eyes that she had never seen there before. She let him in and closed the door behind him, and the storm was muffled but not absent, still pressing against the windows, still making its presence known. "Here," she said, and went to the small chest in the bedroom where she kept a blanket and brought it back and handed it to him without ceremony. He took it and wrapped it around his shoulders and stood by the stove, and the lamplight caught the water still dripping from his hat which he held in one hand, and she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who had been moving toward something for a long time and had finally arrived at it. "You crossed the Cimarron tonight," she said, "in flood." "I had a horse," he said. "Jacob, I know," he said. "I know it was reckless. I know it was not the decision of a reasonable man. But I had information tonight that I needed to act on, and then afterward I needed to come here, and the river was between me and here, and I decided the river was going to have to be what it was." "What information?" she asked, because she needed to know that first. "The 2 men Briggs left behind," he said. "Tom got a report this evening from the Falling Deer family that 2 men had been seen near the East Farm, armed. I went out there with the marshal's deputies, and we found them and took them in. They're in custody now. It's done." She let out a breath she had been holding for longer than tonight. "Were you hurt?" she said. "No," he said. "The Falling Deer family, fine. We got there before anything happened." She nodded. She was standing 6 feet away from him with her arms crossed, not against him but against the feeling in her chest that was pushing toward the surface after 3 years of being held under. "And then you crossed the river," she said. "And then I crossed the river," he agreed. "At midnight, yes, in the middle of a flood. The horse made it," he said. "The horse," she repeated. "Jacob, you could have been swept away, you could have." "I know," he said, and his voice was very quiet and very steady. "I weighed that. I decided it was acceptable." "Against what?" she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word which she had not intended. He looked at her across the lamplight. "Against not saying it," he said. "Annie, I have been not saying it for 3 years. I have told myself there was time, and every time I told myself that I was wrong, because time is the one thing you cannot make more of, and every day I didn't say it was a day I was taking from both of us. And tonight I was standing on the north bank of the Cimarron at midnight in the rain with the river running 10 feet above its normal height, and I thought, if something happens to me out here and I didn't say it, then I was a coward. And I have been a lot of things, but I refused to die a coward." She uncrossed her arms. She did not know she was going to move toward him until she was already doing it, 3 steps across the kitchen floor, and then she stopped because she needed to hear the rest of it. "Say it," she said. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had given her almost nothing for 3 years and were now, in this moment, giving her everything. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for a very long time, longer than I knew what to do with it, and I let that uncertainty cost us both something I cannot give back, and I am sorry for that. I am sorry I did not say it sooner. I should have said it sooner. I should have said it the winter of the first year, when you knocked on my door to say something kind about the robbery, and I sat there thinking about how I didn't deserve to want anything this much, and I let you walk away. I should have said it the spring of the second year, when I watched you with those children at the Christmas program, and understood what it meant that watching you made the world feel less like a place I was just getting through. I should have said it a dozen times and I did not, and I am asking you now to tell me it is not too late." Annie Dugan stood in her kitchen at midnight in the Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1887 and felt 3 years of careful distance collapse like the last wall of a house that had been flooding for a long time, and the flood was warm, and it was not frightening the way she had always been afraid it would be. "It's not too late," she said. He crossed the remaining distance between them and she let him, and when he put his hands on either side of her face, she put her hands on his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was fast and not entirely from the river crossing. And then he kissed her, and it was not a small or uncertain kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been waiting 3 years and had crossed a flooded river to get here and was not going to waste any more time. She kissed him back with equal conviction. When they separated, his forehead came down to rest against hers, and they stood there for a moment with the storm pressing against the house and the lamp burning warm beside them and the whole impossible shape of how they had arrived here around them like something finally visible. "You're still dripping on my floor," she said. "I know," he said. "I apologize." "Don't apologize," she said. "Just stay out of flooded rivers from now on." "I'll do my best," he said. And this time his mouth made the full version of the smile she had been seeing fragments of for 3 years, and it was as undoing as she had always suspected it would be. She made him sit at the kitchen table while she found him a towel and made coffee, real coffee, because it was midnight, and a man who had just crossed the Cimarron in flood deserved something stronger than tea. And he sat at her kitchen table with the blanket still around his shoulders and watched her move around her kitchen with an expression on his face that was so unguarded and so warm that she had to look away twice to keep her composure. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about things they had been not saying, and things they had been saying badly, and things they had said perfectly well, but without the understanding of what the other person meant by them. She told him about Robert Vance. Not everything, not every detail, but the shape of it, the betrayal and the way it had made her distrust her own judgment about men. He listened without flinching and did not minimize it and did not make it about himself. And when she was done, he said, "He was a fool and he didn't deserve you. I'm sorry it happened and I understand why it made things difficult." She told him she had been afraid to trust something that felt like what she felt with him, because she had been afraid of being wrong again, and he said he understood that completely. He told her about Margaret Ferris, which was the first time he had said her name to someone he was this close to in 9 years, and Annie listened with the same unflinching care he had given her, and at the end she said, "She sounds like she was someone worth loving," and he said, "She was." And they were quiet for a moment with the particular respectful silence that is the right response to grief shared honestly. And then he said, "What I feel for you is different. It's not a replacement and it's not a recovery. It's its own thing and it's larger than I know what to do with. You could practice," she said, which was not the most elegant thing she had ever said, but it made him laugh. And his laugh was something she was going to spend a significant amount of the rest of her life seeking. She already knew that. By 2 in the morning, the rain had slowed to something that was still rain, but was no longer a statement of intent from the sky. He needed to get back across the river before dawn, before the town woke and saw the sheriff emerging from the schoolteacher's house at sunrise, which would be a fact that required no interpretation. "You can't cross the river in the dark," she said. "I crossed it in the dark to get here," he said. "You were making a point then," she said. "Now you're just being reckless." "I was reckless to get here," he said, "which I'm not sorry about." "Then be careful going back," she said. "Wait until there's enough light to see the water." He stayed until 4 in the morning, by which time the sky was beginning to lighten at the eastern edge and the rain had reduced itself to a steady drizzle. She stood on the porch and watched him go, his tall figure moving down Cedar Street toward the north end of town and the river, and she stood there in the cool gray pre-dawn with her arms around herself and felt something that was unmistakably happiness, which was a feeling she had kept at careful arm's length for 3 years, and which was now, evidently, not going anywhere. He made it across. She knew he would. She received confirmation of this when Tom Castle stopped by the school at morning recess with a note written in Jacob's handwriting that said, "River crossed, horse fine, everything intact, dinner tonight, and at the bottom, I am still glad I came." She wrote back, "Dinner yes. 7 o'clock, Cedar Street," and at the bottom, "So am I, the dinner on the 4th of April, 1887, was the beginning of something that the town of Cutter's Bend watched develop with the collective satisfaction of people who have been correct about something for a long time and are very willing to accept their vindication gracefully. Clara Hobbs was observed smiling during 3 consecutive days of morning errands. Tom Castles was heard singing in the jail. The barber on 4th Street reportedly said, "About time," to no one in particular, and everyone understood what he meant. Jacob and Annie took the transition from carefully maintained distance to openly acknowledged relationship, with a combination of grace and awkwardness that was entirely characteristic of who they both were. They were private people, and they did not perform their happiness for the town's benefit, but neither did they pretend, and within 2 weeks it was simply understood by everyone that the sheriff and the schoolteacher were together, and that this was correct and good. The practical details of the new normal were established with some negotiation and considerable mutual respect. Jacob began spending his evenings on Cedar Street 3 or 4 times a week, and Annie came to the sheriff's office sometimes in the late afternoon when the school day was done, and they talked the way people talk when they have been storing up 3 years' worth of conversations for each other and are finally able to have them. In May, the marshal's deputies concluded their work in Cutter's Bend and departed for Guthrie with the evidence against Harlan Briggs. The warrant for Briggs's arrest was issued by the territorial court, and he was apprehended in the Texas Panhandle in late June, transported to Guthrie in July, and indicted in August on charges of water rights interference and conspiracy with a public official, specifically the Tulsa land clerk, whose cooperation with the prosecution had helped establish the case fully. The water rights of the 4 Eastern families were secured by territorial order, and the Falling Deer family, whose situation had first alerted Jacob to the pattern of Briggs's acquisitions, received formal recognition of their land claim. Jacob told Annie about the final resolution of the Briggs matter on a warm evening in August, sitting on her porch in the last light of the day, and she listened and then was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'm glad it's settled. I'm glad those families have their water." "So am I," he said. "Jacob," she said. "Yes. When you said you should have said it sooner, exactly how much sooner were you thinking?" He looked at her with that expression she had learned to read by now, the one that was thinking carefully about honesty. "About 2.5 years sooner," he said. "That's what I thought," she said without heat. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "I know you are," she said. "I wasted time too. We were both very stupid." "We were," he agreed. "Let's not do that again," she said. "No," he said. "Let's not." He asked her to marry him on a Saturday morning in October of 1887, which was exactly 3 years and 1 month after she had arrived in Cutter's Bend. He did it without grand ceremony, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee between them and the October light coming through the east window, and he said, "I know I was late to say the first thing. I don't want to be late with this one. Annie Dugan, I would like very much to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" She said yes before he finished the sentence, which delighted him. She said yes and then said, "You were going to ask last month, weren't you? I could see you working up to something." He looked at her with the combination of amusement and slight wounded dignity that she had come to love in him. "I was organizing my thoughts," he said. "You had organized them," she said. "You were just frightened." "Possibly," he said. "It's all right," she said. "I'm a little frightened too." "Of marrying me." "Of wanting something this much," she said honestly. "It's still new, wanting things without being afraid they'll be taken." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it with that steadiness that was one of the things she trusted most about him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, "unless there's another flood and another emergency, and even then I'll come back." "You had better," she said. They were married on the 12th of November, 1887, in the church that doubled as a schoolhouse, which meant they were married in the building where Annie had taught for 3 years, and several of her former students, now slightly older and slightly taller, sat in the pews and watched with the particular touching seriousness of children attending adult ceremonies. Clara Hobbs cried with frank and unashamed happiness. Tom Castles served as best man and managed not to drop the ring, which Jacob had teased him about extensively in the week prior. The minister, Reverend Hawes, who had been performing services in Cutter's Bend for 4 years, and had watched the situation between Jacob and Annie, with the patience of a man accustomed to things working out in God's time, conducted the ceremony with warmth and a very slight air of "I told you so" that he was too dignified to state explicitly. Annie wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from a catalog in September, and that fit her exactly right, which was itself a small miracle of frontier commerce, and she carried a spray of late-season wildflowers that Eli Ketterly's mother had gathered for her from the river meadow. Jacob wore his best clothes, which were very clean and did not include his badge, because this was his day as a man and not a sheriff, and he stood at the front of that room and watched Annie walk toward him and felt the entirety of his life rearrange itself around something solid. They settled into the house on Cedar Street for the winter, which required some adjustment of the available space and considerable discussion of whose furniture should go where, which was their first sustained negotiation as a married couple, and which they conducted with reasonable good humor, and only 2 moments of genuine impasse, one involving a particular chair that Jacob was sentimentally attached to and that Annie found aesthetically unfortunate, and one involving the placement of the kitchen shelves, which was resolved by Tom Castles's unexpected carpentry skills. The winter of 1887 and 1888 was long and cold, and entirely comfortable in the way that winters are comfortable when you are inside a warm house with someone you love. They developed the domestic language that couples develop, the shorthand, and the silence that means something, and the particular way of being in the same room without needing to account for it. Annie continued teaching. Jacob continued serving as sheriff. The town continued its life around them, which included a new family arriving from Missouri in December, a dispute over cattle that required a week of Jacob's careful attention in January, a mild winter illness that swept through the schoolchildren in February and kept Annie occupied with worried parents, and the slow turning of the territory toward the spring. Tom Castles, who had been a deputy for 3 years and had grown into the work with considerable competence, began courting a young woman named Delia Marsh, who had come to Cutter's Bend with her family in January, and Jacob watched this development with the particular warm satisfaction of someone who had recently found his own way through that particular territory and knew where the hard parts were. He gave Tom exactly as much advice as Tom asked for, which was not much, and was available to listen when Tom needed to talk through something, which was occasionally. Spring came again, and with it the anniversary of the flood crossing, which Annie marked by leaving a small jar of preserves on Jacob's desk at the office with a card that said 1 year since the river and nothing else. He came home that evening and kissed her in the kitchen before he even took his hat off and said, "Thank you for that. The preserves." "The note," he said, "and the preserves, but mostly the note." In April of 1888, Annie told Jacob that she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning, choosing the moment deliberately, when they were both at the kitchen table before he left for the office, and the light was good, and the day was not yet complicated. She told him simply and directly, which was how she told most things, and watched his face. What happened to his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not surprise exactly, because they had both known this was possible and neither had been unwilling, but it was something beyond surprise, something that went all the way to the foundation of who he was and came back changed. His eyes got bright, which she had never seen happen before, and he got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair the way you do when you want to be at someone's level, and he took her hands in both of his. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm very well," she said. "It's very early still, but I'm well." "I love you," he said, and it came out with the uncomplicated force of something that had been settling into him for a long time and had now reached bedrock. "I know," she said. I love you too, she touched his face. You're going to be very good at this. I don't know that, he said. I do, she said. I've been watching you with children for 3 years. You forget that I was your town's schoolteacher first. He smiled, fully, the smile she had been working to earn for 3 years, and that was now hers on a regular basis, and still did something to her every time. The summer of 1888 moved through its months with Annie's pregnancy marking time in its own way, the gradual change and the growing reality of another person becoming part of their life. She taught through the summer and into the fall, which required some adjustment and some negotiation with the school board, who were generally supportive if slightly uncertain about convention. She was one of the few women in the territory who had both a professional position and a marriage, and she had decided from the beginning that she was not willing to give up the teaching simply because her personal life had changed. Jacob supported this without reservation, which was one of the things she loved about him. In September, Clara Hobbs organized a gathering that was technically described as a sewing circle, but was functionally a celebration of Annie's coming child, and the women of Cutter's Bend brought small gifts and practical items in conversation, and Annie sat in Clara's front room and looked around at these women, some of whom she had known for 4 years now, and felt the warmth of having stayed somewhere long enough to be known. The child was born on the 15th of November, 1888, which was 3 days after their first wedding anniversary, in the house on Cedar Street with the midwife and Clara Hobbs present. It was a boy, which Jacob learned by sitting in the front room for 5 hours in the state of helpless alertness that is the particular torment of fathers, and hearing Clara Hobbs emerge from the bedroom door and say, "You have a son, Jacob, and Annie as well." He was on his feet before Clara finished the first sentence, and he stood in the doorway and looked at his wife in the bed with the small, red-faced creature in her arms, and felt something that did not have an adequate word in any language he knew. Annie looked up at him. She was tired in the profound way of someone who has done something enormous, but her eyes were brilliant. "Come and see him," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy, who was very new and very complete and who had a quantity of dark hair that seemed ambitious given how recently he had arrived. "Hello," Jacob said to his son, because it seemed like the right thing to say. "He looks like you," Annie said, "around the forehead." "He looks alarmed," Jacob said, which made Annie laugh, which made the baby startle, which made them both laugh more quietly. They named him Thomas Henry Mercer, the Thomas for Tom Castles, who was deeply honored and immediately concerned about the responsibility of being a namesake, and the Henry for Annie's father, who had been dead for 2 years and whose absence she felt on this day with the particular sharpness of good news that cannot be shared with someone who should have been there. Tom Castles came to see the baby on the afternoon of the 16th and stood holding him with the careful terror of a young man holding a very new person for the first time and said, "He's very small," in a tone of genuine wonder. "They start that way," Jacob said. "He has your jaw," Tom said. "Everyone says the forehead," Jacob said. "Now it's the jaw." "Both," Annie said from the bed, where she was eating soup and watching her husband and his deputy examine her son with the expressions of men who were thoroughly undone by something and not sure what to do about that. The winter of 1888 and 1889 was defined by the new dimension that Thomas Henry Mercer added to the house on Cedar Street and to the life of Cutter's Bend more generally. Jacob, who had lived alone for the better part of 15 years, and had organized his existence around the singular demands of his work, discovered that he was entirely willing to reorganize that existence around someone who weighed 7.5 pounds and had strong opinions about sleep schedules. Annie had known he would be good at this. She had been right, which was not a surprise to her, but the specific ways he was good at it were sometimes surprising. He was patient with the night waking in a way that she had not expected, taking his turn without complaint, and with the same steady attention he brought to everything. He was curious about the child, genuinely and continually curious, watching Thomas with the observational care he usually reserved for professional matters, as though every small development was data to be examined. He also continued to be the sheriff of Cutter's Bend with undiminished dedication, which meant that there were nights when the work kept him from home and Annie managed alone, which she was entirely capable of, and which she had always been capable of, and which was simply the reality of being married to someone whose work had genuine stakes. She resumed teaching in January of 1889, when Thomas was 2 months old, and Clara Hobbs and 2 of the other women in town created an informal arrangement that allowed the baby to be cared for during school hours, which Annie accepted with the gratitude of someone who had learned that independence and community were not opposites. The Oklahoma Territory underwent considerable change in 1889. The land run of April 22 opened up the unassigned lands to settlement, and while Cutter's Bend was already an established community and not directly in the path of the rush, the general energy of the territory shifted as thousands of people arrived and new towns formed overnight. Jacob spent a good deal of April and May managing the secondary effects of this, the disputes and the confusion and the legal complexities that accompanied the dramatic expansion, and Annie followed the news with the interest of someone who had been paying attention to land and rights and the politics of settlement for long enough to understand what was at stake. She talked to Jacob about it the way they talked about most things, directly and substantively, and he valued her perspective with a genuine respect that had been part of their dynamic from the beginning, before either of them had admitted anything else. By the fall of 1889, Thomas was walking, or at least executing what might generously be called an aggressive controlled falling toward various destinations, and the house on Cedar Street had acquired the comfortable chaos of a house with an ambulatory child in it. Jacob had reinforced the lower shelves and moved the rifle case to a height well above small person reach, and had devoted an entire afternoon to identifying and removing every sharp corner at Thomas's current level, which Tom Castles had assisted with, and which they had both approached with the thoroughness of men conducting a security assessment. Annie watched this operation from the kitchen table and did not say that they were being excessive, because they were not being excessive, and also because the sight of her husband and his deputy systematically toddler-proofing her home was one she wished she could preserve exactly. In the spring of 1890, Annie was expecting again. She told Jacob the same way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, the going to the foundation quality, and he came around the table to her the same way. And this time Thomas, who was 16 months old and very interested in anything that involved both parents being close together, attempted to participate by climbing Jacob's leg, which somewhat altered the moment but not its essential quality. "Thomas," Jacob said. Thomas said something conclusive in the language of 16-month-olds and continued climbing. "He agrees with you," Annie said. "What am I saying?" Jacob said. "That you're very glad," Annie said. He looked at her over the top of his son's determined head. "I am," he said, "very glad." The second child arrived in October of 1890 and was a girl, which Thomas received with philosophical indifference and which Jacob received with a look of complete helplessness that Annie found entirely endearing. They named her Clara Margaret Mercer, the Clara for Clara Hobbs, without whom their lives in Cutter's Bend would have been significantly less rich, and the Margaret held quietly and with respect for what it meant to Jacob, and he had chosen it himself. When he suggested it, Annie had looked at him carefully and he had said, "She would have liked you." And I want to carry something forward from her, not as grief but as gratitude. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," Annie said, and meant it completely. Clara Hobbs, whose name had been given to the baby, was told about this honor at a Sunday dinner and cried with such heartfelt enthusiasm that she had to excuse herself twice, and came back both times having regained composure, and then immediately lost it again. and it was one of the best Sunday dinners any of them had ever had. Tom Castles married Delia Marsh in the spring of 1891, in the same church where Jacob and Annie had married, and it was Jacob's turn to stand in the pews and watch his deputy and friend make the same journey he had made. And he stood there with Annie beside him and Thomas on his other side and baby Clara in Annie's arms, and felt the accumulated warmth of a life that had come good, that had been brought to goodness by choices made and things said that should have been said sooner, and by one very decisive midnight river crossing. The town of Cutter's Bend grew through those years in the way that Oklahoma Territory towns grew, slowly and then quickly, and then with a kind of permanent character that made them real places rather than temporary stops. New families arrived, new businesses opened, the school grew and eventually required a second teacher, which Annie helped recruit, and whom she mentored with the particular care of someone who remembered what it was like to arrive in a new place and need to find your footing. Jacob served as sheriff of Cutter's Bend for 17 years in total, a tenure that was unmatched in the territory, and that came to represent a kind of constancy that the town understood was rare and valuable. He was offered a position with the territorial marshal's office in 1892 and turned it down, not because he was unqualified but because Cutter's Bend was where he was needed and where he belonged, and those two things, in his view, were the relevant considerations. Annie never stopped teaching. She taught for 22 years in Cutter's Bend, and the children she taught grew up, and some of them came back, and some of them went on to other places and carried something she had given them: the expectation of their own capacity, the knowledge that thinking carefully and honestly was not just for men, or for the wealthy, or for people from cities in the East. She taught Eli Ketterly and two of his younger siblings, and eventually two of the falling deer children, and the children of families who arrived in the land-run years and needed a teacher who would take their children seriously. Thomas Henry Mercer grew up to be a tall, dark-haired young man with his father's jaw and his mother's directness, which was a combination that Jacob found occasionally overwhelming and more often deeply satisfying. He was interested in law and in horses, and in a girl named June Fuller whose family had come from Kansas, and who stood up to Thomas with the same non-negotiable quality that his mother had always brought to his father, which Jacob considered an excellent sign, and Annie considered inevitable. Clara Margaret Mercer was, from a very early age, the person who said the thing no one else in the room had said yet, which was a characteristic that required some management in childhood and became in adulthood a quality that the people around her learned to appreciate, sometimes after initial resistance. She was interested in medicine, which was not a conventional interest for a girl in the Oklahoma Territory in the 1890s, but which Annie refused to discourage, and Jacob funded by ordering her every book he could find on the subject, which was his consistent method of supporting his children's serious interests. In the fall of 1892, on a quiet evening when the children were in bed and the night was cool, and they were sitting on the porch that Jacob had extended the previous spring to accommodate the number of people who regularly ended up on it, Annie said to him, "Do you think about the crossing still, the river?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than avoiding. "Sometimes," he said. "When the river runs high in spring, I think about what it was like on that bank, standing there deciding." "What was the deciding like?" she asked. "It was the easiest decision I ever made," he said. "That's the part that surprised me. I thought it would feel reckless or frightening, and it felt like the most obvious thing I had ever done, like I had finally caught up with what I should have been doing all along." She looked at him in the evening light, this man she had been married to for 5 years, who had crossed a flooded river in the dark to tell her something true, who had built a life with her out of all that careful stubbornness and all that patient love. "I'm glad you did," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat in the October evening with the sounds of the town around them, and the children sleeping inside, and the stars beginning to show in the deep blue sky above the territory. and the river running somewhere to the north of them, quieter now, in its proper banks, the way things are when the season has passed and the waters have come down to what they were meant to be. There was a third child, a boy named William James Mercer, born in 1893, who arrived with the composed determination of someone who had assessed the available family and decided it would do. He had Annie's coloring and his own particular personality, and he became, by the age of 4, the primary emotional arbiter of the household, approaching conflicts between his older siblings with the serene certainty that he understood the situation better than either party, which was frequently and inexplicably correct. Clara Hobbs, who was William's godmother and who was by this point a woman in her 60s with white hair and undiminished energy, declared William to be the most like his father of all 3 children, which Jacob received as a compliment and Annie received as a warning, and they were both correct. Tom Castles eventually became the sheriff of Cutter's Bend when Jacob stepped down in 1901, which Jacob had been preparing Tom for without explicitly saying so for the better part of a decade, and which Tom stepped into with the quiet competence of someone who had been watching how it was done for 17 years by the best example he could have had. Delia Castles told Annie at the celebration dinner that Tom slept better after the change, that the responsibility had always been there, but the official weight of it had been on Jacob, and now that it was squarely Tom's, he seemed to have settled into it fully. Jacob, for his part, did not know exactly what to do with himself without the badge for about 3 weeks, during which Annie watched him with the patient amusement of someone who knew the adjustment was temporary, and that the man was constitutionally incapable of being idle. She was proven right when he was approached by the newly established territorial attorney's office with a request to serve as an investigator and consultant on cases requiring someone with long experience in the territory and the kind of reputation that opened doors, and he accepted and found that the work suited him in a different key, the same notes but a different instrument. The Oklahoma Territory became the state of Oklahoma in November of 1907, an event that Annie and Jacob watched from the porch of their house on Cedar Street, the same house where 3 years had begun and a flood crossing had ended, now extended and deepened by the lives they had built in it. Thomas was 19 and had already read more law than most men twice his age, and was making plans to study formally in Guthrie. Clara was 17 and had found a doctor willing to take her on as an apprentice, a woman named Dr. Patience Reed, who had come to the territory with more than enough conviction to override convention. William was 14 and had recently decided he was going to be a rancher, which Jacob took seriously and Annie considered, and which evolved over the following years into something more complex and more interesting than simple cattle management. Annie and Jacob stood on the porch on the day Oklahoma became a state and listened to the celebrations from the center of town, the bells and the general noise of a community marking a moment, and Jacob said, "We've been here 23 years. "You've been here longer," she said. "You were here before I arrived." "I know," he said, "but the counting really starts when you got here." She turned to look at him. He was 52 years old, and the gray that had begun at his temples was now more general, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, and he was still the steadiest and the most infuriatingly composed and the most quietly devastating man she had ever known. "That's a very romantic thing to say," she said. "I've been practicing," he said. "For 23 years," she said. "For 20, he corrected. "The first 3 I wasted." She laughed, which she still did at this, because it was still true and it was still ridiculous, and it was also the origin of everything, the waste of those 3 years and the decision to stop wasting, which was one of the most important decisions either of them had ever made. "Jacob," she said. "Yes. I'm glad you were stubborn enough to cross the river. I'm glad you let me in the door," he said. "I almost didn't," she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, but it was the comfortable kind, the kind you tell when the truth is too large to say simply. "No, you didn't," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the solid, familiar weight of him that she had known for 20 years, and that still felt like something she had chosen, every day, which was the right way to feel about a person, the ongoing choosing rather than the settled assumption. The years after statehood moved with the particular quality of years in a life that is full and good, not without difficulty, not without the losses that time brings. Clara Hobbs passed in 1909 at the age of 78, having remained, to the end, the kind of person who made rooms warmer by being in them, and the Mercer family grieved her with the depth of people who had genuinely lost someone irreplaceable, and honored her in the way she would have wanted, which was by continuing to feed people and keep their doors open and pay attention to each other. Thomas Mercer married June Fuller in 1910, and they settled in Guthrie, where Thomas practiced law with a reputation for taking cases that others found inconvenient, which was very much his mother's influence and slightly his father's. And they had children who came to Cutter's Bend in the summers and called Jacob and Annie by their grandfather and grandmother names, and were entirely comfortable at the house on Cedar Street, which had accumulated the layers of a life well lived the way houses do when people love them. Clara Mercer, who was by 1910 20 years old and Dr. Reed's most skilled apprentice, was on her way to becoming one of the first practicing female physicians in the new state of Oklahoma, which she accomplished by the time she was 24 with the same calm certainty that had characterized her since she was 3 years old, and had informed her family at breakfast that the word they were looking for was approximately, rather than about. She did not marry early, and when she eventually did, at 29, it was to a doctor who had come from the East and who was sensible enough to understand that he was marrying a full person and not a partial one. And Jacob shook the man's hand at the wedding with the evaluating grip of a former sheriff, and the man met it without flinching, which was the right response. William Mercer did indeed become a rancher, and a very good one, with a particular gift for the management of land that suggested he had been paying attention to every water dispute and land record conversation he had heard in his childhood household. And he married a woman named Ellen Pratt, who was from a farming family and who was, Annie thought when she met her, the most sensible person she had ever encountered, which was a quality that complemented William's particular kind of intelligence perfectly. Annie and Jacob grew into their older years with the gracefulness of people who have been genuinely happy and know it, which is not a common kind of gracefulness and should not be understated. They had not been without difficulty or sorrow or the normal weight of a life fully lived, but they had faced all of it as people who had chosen each other honestly and had, after a long beginning, never wasted time. Annie kept a journal. She had always kept one, but in the later years it became something she returned to with more deliberateness, writing down not just events but the texture of things, the quality of a morning, the particular way Jacob laughed at something unexpected, the color of the sky over the territory in October, the weight of a grandchild in her arms. Jacob read some of these entries after Annie showed him one, on a winter evening when the house was quiet and the grandchildren had gone back to their various lives, and he read it with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered, and then he said, "You write the way you see things." "How do I see things?" she asked. "Clearly," he said. "But kindly, which is harder than it sounds." She took the journal back. "You've gotten better at saying things," she said. "I had a good reason to practice," he said. She smiled. She was 62 years old, and she was sitting in the house on Cedar Street in Cutter's Bend, Oklahoma, which was a town she had come to in 1884 with 2 trunks and a determination never to depend on a man's word again. And she had stayed because the land was good, and the people were real, and because a man had crossed a flooded river in the dark to tell her something he should have said sooner, and she had let him in, and everything that had followed from that had been, on the whole and in the essential, the best possible version of the life she had been trying to build when she arrived. The house on Cedar Street was still standing. The east window still faced the morning. The stove was a different stove, replaced twice over the years, but it sat in the same place. The porch was larger than the original and had been repaired several times and bore the marks of 3 children and multiple grandchildren in its boards. The Cimarron still ran to the north of town and still flooded in the spring, as rivers do, as rivers always have, following the laws of water and season that no deed or determination can alter. Every spring when the rains came heavy and the river made its old sound, Annie would stand in the kitchen and listen, and she would think of a man standing on the north bank in the dark and rain deciding whether to cross. She was always glad he crossed. She had been glad every day since, and she expected to be glad about it for every day that remained to her, which she intended to be many, and which turned out to be a number sufficient to see her grandchildren grown, and to see the town she had helped build change and persist and remain, as good places do, itself. Jacob lived to 78. He died on a clear morning in the late autumn, in the house on Cedar Street, with Annie beside him and the east window showing the light that had always come through it at that hour. It was not a hard dying, which was the mercy given to a man who had done his work honestly and had said the things that needed saying, and had crossed whatever rivers were in the way. Annie kept the house and kept the journal and kept the east window for the mornings for 10 years more, and when she was done she had lived a life that was, by any fair accounting, a complete and good one. She was buried beside Jacob in the Cutter's Bend Cemetery under 2 cottonwoods that had been saplings when she arrived and were now large and permanent and not going anywhere, which seemed right, which seemed like exactly the right place for the 2 of them to be. The town remembered them both. The school where Annie had taught was eventually named for her, the Annie Dugan Mercer Schoolhouse, a name that Clara Mercer had advocated for with the same calm certainty she brought to everything, and which the town council approved unanimously. Jacob's tenure as sheriff was the longest in the county and was recorded in the early histories of the state, with the kind of accuracy that honest men receive when enough people who knew them are still alive to insist on the truth. But the story that the town told most often, the one that got passed down through the families of Cutter's Bend into the next generation and the one after that, was the one about the night Jacob Mercer crossed the Cimarron in flood at midnight to stand on Annie Dugan's porch and tell her what he should have said years before. It got told at the Red Mare, and at dinner tables, and at the kind of gatherings where people talk about the past with the warmth of something they are proud to have been part of. It got told because it was true, and because it was the kind of truth that people recognize, the truth about waiting too long and then deciding not to wait any longer, about pride and fear and the river between you and what you need to say, about what a person will cross when they have finally run out of reasons not to. The river had been in flood. The hour had been midnight. He had crossed it anyway, and she had opened the door, and that, in the end, was everything.